Special Agent Ethan Parker begins his recollection of a challenging flight, a story he never imagined he'd have to tell. As he sits in his quiet office at the Bureau of National Investigations, Ethan reviews his flight log and personal notes with a mixture of disbelief and residual frustration. He recalls that on one particular day, after a long, exhausting series of briefings and field operations, he finally boarded a commercial flight hoping for a brief respite. Ethan had always prided himself on his ability to maintain composure under pressure, whether facing dangerous missions or enduring the monotony of long-haul flights. That day, however, the universe seemed determined to test him in unexpected ways. As he prepared to board the plane, he was already mentally bracing himself for an ordeal that would soon unfold, a stark contrast to the disciplined professionalism that had defined his career. He remembers the moment he stepped onto the jet. The hum of the engines and the cool, recycled air inside the cabin provided a fleeting sense of relief. Yet, beneath that calm exterior, Ethan's mind was already replaying the events of the day, late-night stakeouts, urgent calls over intercepted communications, and the quiet determination that had driven him through it all. Now, as he sat in that sterile environment, he couldn't shake the feeling that his day was far from over. Ethan reflects on the irony that, as an agent tasked with protecting national security, he now found himself a mere passenger on a crowded flight. In that moment, he felt both insignificant and inexplicably vulnerable, like a lone guardian without his usual tools at hand. He wondered silently if the upcoming hours would test his resolve in ways he had never imagined. Although he was used to unpredictable fieldwork, the confined space of a commercial airplane presented its own set of challenges. The low murmur of conversations, the rustling of snack bags, and the occasional overhead announcement filled the air, but none of it prepared him for the personal confrontation that was about to disrupt his fragile peace. He sat back, trying to focus on a dog-eared novel in his lap, when a nagging thought took root in his mind: today might not be as routine as he hoped. This narrative, he later realized, would become one of those stories that, despite its seeming triviality compared to national threats, would leave a lasting impact on his memory. Little did he know that the series of events that began in the humdrum of a flight would soon escalate into an episode that challenged not only his patience but also his core beliefs about respect, decency, and authority. After clearing security and navigating the busy terminal, Ethan Parker finally boarded his flight, a long, cross-country journey that promised the relative comfort of an upgraded economy cabin. His heart lightened somewhat as he made his way down the narrow jet bridge. Finding an available seat, he selected an aisle spot in the airline's Economy Plus section. The extra legroom and slightly more spacious seat offered a small luxury for a federal agent used to the rigors of covert operations. Ethan carefully stowed his carry-on bag in the overhead compartment and settled into his seat. He adjusted the small, personal entertainment screen embedded in the seatback and activated the in-flight Wi-Fi to check his email. For a moment, everything seemed normal: quiet hums of the engines, a soft murmur of announcements from the flight crew, and the muted chatter of fellow passengers created an atmosphere of transient calm. He noticed that the section was sparsely occupied, giving him ample space to stretch out and relax. Ethan pulled out a notepad from his briefcase, a habit from his field days when he recorded observations discreetly, and jotted down a few notes about the flight schedule and service announcements. As he did so, he recalled the long hours and endless briefing sessions he had endured that morning. The transition from the high-stakes environment of his job to the mundane routine of a commercial flight was jarring, yet he welcomed the temporary escape. Looking out the small oval window, Ethan observed the sprawling cityscape below gradually giving way to patches of farmland and winding highways. The rhythmic pattern of the plane's ascent and steady cruise was soothing. He took a deep breath, allowing the familiarity of the routine to restore a measure of tranquility to his mind. Around him, passengers chatted softly or immersed themselves in personal devices. A couple exchanged quiet laughter over a shared tablet, while a solitary traveler tapped away on a laptop. Amid this microcosm of transient lives, Ethan's mind remained alert. He wasn't sure if it was habit or instinct, but years of training had instilled in him a readiness to notice even the smallest deviation from the norm. He settled back into his seat, drawing comfort from the orderly environment. The seat's adjustable headrest and generous space allowed him to lean back slightly, his thoughts drifting between past operations and the mundane details of his current journey. He reminded himself that, as an agent, he had a responsibility to remain vigilant, no matter where he was. Even during a quiet flight, he maintained an internal checklist of observations, quietly assessing the behaviors of those around him. Yet, as Ethan scrolled through his email and briefly responded to a message from his supervisor, a subtle unease tugged at the edges of his awareness. It was a fleeting sensation, almost imperceptible, as if a small anomaly had crept into the perfect order of his flight. For a brief moment, he wondered if he was simply overthinking, a relic of the high-alert mindset that defined his career. But he dismissed the thought quickly, attributing it to nerves from a long day's work. As the plane began its final approach to its destination, Ethan closed his notepad, feeling cautiously optimistic that his flight would remain uneventful. Little did he know that the seemingly peaceful journey was about to take a dramatic turn, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test his patience and resolve in unexpected ways. As the cabin lights dimmed for the mid-flight service, Ethan Parker continued to enjoy his relative solitude until the overhead door opened and a new passenger began to board. At that moment, the atmosphere in the aisles subtly shifted. A woman, soon to be known as Carmen, entered the plane accompanied by a young boy with an exuberant smile and boundless energy. The boy, who would later be identified as Miles, immediately drew the attention of several passengers with his lively chatter and occasional bursts of laughter. Carmen moved briskly down the aisle, her presence commanding attention even as she juggled a small carry-on and the energetic child in tow. Ethan observed her with a practiced, analytical eye. Carmen's attire was neat and professional, and her expression conveyed a sense of urgency. However, the boy, Miles, displayed none of the restraint typically expected on an airplane. He talked animatedly, occasionally tugging at his mother's hand, his voice rising over the ambient murmur of the cabin. Ethan, accustomed to the unpredictability of human behavior, smiled slightly at the boy's exuberance. Yet, he couldn't help but notice a certain disarray as Carmen attempted to calm Miles, whose excitement seemed uncontainable. The woman appeared anxious, frequently glancing at Miles with a mixture of concern and exasperation. In her hurried pace, she negotiated the cramped aisle with little regard for the order of the already packed cabin. Passengers began to murmur as Carmen passed, some sympathizing with her obvious stress, others irritated by the noise. Ethan, seated near the front, tried to focus on the in-flight magazine, but his attention was repeatedly drawn back to the unfolding scene. He noted the contrast between his own calm composure and Carmen's frazzled state, a state that hinted at an impending disruption. As Carmen reached the central section of the plane, she scanned the rows of seats, her eyes briefly locking onto Ethan's seat. There was an unspoken urgency in her glance, as if she hoped he might provide a solution to her problem. Moments later, she approached him with a hesitant smile that didn't quite mask her anxiety. "Excuse me," she said in a slightly breathless tone, "I'm sorry to trouble you, but my son, Miles, often gets airsick. Would you mind switching seats with me so he can be near the window?" Ethan regarded her request with a measured calm. He had chosen his seat deliberately, a spot that provided a good view of the cabin and easy access to the aisle. Moreover, his routine rarely included disruptions once he was comfortably settled. "I'm sorry," he replied politely, "but I'd prefer to remain in my current seat. I've already settled in quite nicely." Carmen's face contorted momentarily in frustration, and the nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably. The boy's chatter grew louder, and Carmen's tone took on a desperate edge as she tried to explain further. "But it's just that he gets very nauseous. I really need a window seat for him. It's for his health." Ethan maintained his composure. "I understand your concern," he said evenly, "but I'm afraid I can't accommodate that change." His refusal was firm yet gentle, his voice carrying no malice, only the resolve of a man who had long practiced keeping his boundaries intact. The brief exchange left a palpable tension in the aisle. Carmen's eyes flashed with irritation, and Miles began to fidget restlessly. Passengers exchanged glances, some murmuring in sympathy for the mother's plight, others in annoyance at the inconvenience. Ethan felt a pang of empathy for Carmen's obvious stress, yet he remained steadfast in his decision. The situation, though minor in the grand scheme of things, was already hinting at deeper undercurrents, an undercurrent of frustration that could escalate further if not managed properly. As Carmen returned to her row, still fuming, the ambient noise in the cabin slowly resumed its steady drone. Yet for Ethan, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. He sensed that this was only the beginning of what might become a series of unexpected challenges on this flight, a challenge that would test his patience and force him to navigate the delicate interplay of personal space, parental urgency, and the unpredictable nature of human conflict. Shortly after settling back into his seat and attempting to focus on a magazine, Ethan Parker was interrupted once more. From his seat, he heard a soft, almost pleading voice behind him. It was Carmen, the frazzled woman he had encountered earlier. She approached again, this time with an air of urgency that could not be ignored. "Mr. Parker, I truly need your help," she began, her tone laced with desperation. "My son, Miles, is already showing signs of airsickness. Please, if you could just swap seats with me, it would make a world of difference. I can't let him suffer like this." Ethan felt a slight twinge of sympathy for the distressed mother and her energetic child. However, he had already set his mind on keeping his assigned seat. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said gently, "but I really must remain here. I chose this seat specifically, and I'm comfortable." Carmen's eyes widened, and for a moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. The little boy, Miles, wrinkled his nose and clutched his mother's hand, his restlessness intensifying. "Please," Carmen implored, stepping closer. "I'm not asking for much. Just a small change. He gets so sick, and I worry for his health. A window seat would calm him, and it might even help him settle down." Ethan's inner conflict deepened. On one hand, he understood the plight of a worried mother desperate to protect her child's well-being. On the other, he had carefully chosen his seat, a sanctuary of order and quiet, after a taxing day at work. He had little desire to disrupt his plans for a peaceful flight, yet he could not ignore the earnest look in Carmen's eyes. "I truly empathize with you," Ethan said, softening his tone further. "But I must respectfully decline. I've already prepared for this journey, and I can't change my seat now." His tone was firm yet respectful, conveying both his personal boundaries and his professional courtesy. Carmen's expression shifted quickly from pleading to frustration. Her voice, previously soft, now carried an edge as she retorted, "Are you saying that my child's well-being is less important than your comfort?" The accusation hung heavily in the aisle, and several passengers turned their heads to listen. Ethan maintained his composure. "I'm simply following my own plans. I understand you're in a difficult situation, but I'm not in a position to help with a seat change." He offered a small, apologetic smile, hoping to diffuse the tension. The exchange grew increasingly strained. Carmen's eyes glistened with unshed tears of frustration as she pressed on, "I've tried explaining this calmly, but you're not listening. Miles is already turning pale from nausea. If you truly cared about others, you'd understand that sometimes a little kindness goes a long way." Ethan's resolve remained unyielding, though he could see the distress on her face. He weighed the moment carefully. The decision was personal, one he had made before boarding, but the emotional weight of the situation was undeniable. "I'm sorry you're in distress, but I cannot switch seats," he repeated firmly. Around them, the hum of the cabin resumed, but the space between them was thick with unspoken tension. A few nearby passengers exchanged sympathetic glances with Carmen, while others frowned at Ethan's refusal. Miles, the young boy, continued to squirm, his discomfort growing with each passing moment. Carmen took a step back, her shoulders slumping in resignation and anger. "Fine," she muttered, voice barely audible as she turned away, her eyes filled with bitter disappointment. "I guess you just don't care." Ethan watched her retreat to her row, feeling a pang of regret amid his resolve. He knew that, as a man who valued order and planning, he might appear unyielding. Yet he also believed that every individual was entitled to their comfort, even if it meant standing firm on one's own choices. For the remainder of the flight, Ethan found it difficult to shake the memory of that brief confrontation. Every time he glanced up at the aisle, he recalled Carmen's desperate plea and the quiet, conflicted tears that had threatened to spill. The incident had disrupted his calm, making him question whether a small act of refusal could ripple into something much larger. He resolved, however, that he must remain true to his decision. In his mind, the balance between personal responsibility and compassionate flexibility was delicate, yet he had made his choice, and now the flight must continue. The tension eventually eased, replaced by a muted acceptance of the day's challenges. Still, the encounter left a lingering impression on him, a reminder that even in the controlled environment of a flight, human emotion and conflict could erupt unexpectedly. Shortly after their exchange about the seat change, the atmosphere in the cabin began to heat up. Carmen, still visibly agitated, retreated to her seat in a huddle with her young son, Miles, who fidgeted uncomfortably. Minutes later, the tension returned, this time in the form of raised voices echoing down the aisle. Carmen abruptly stood up and marched back toward Ethan's row. "I can't believe you'd be so selfish," she shouted, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "Do you really think your comfort is more important than a little boy's health?" Her tone was accusatory, the words heavy with a sense of moral outrage. Ethan, taken aback by the escalation, maintained his calm exterior. He adjusted his position, ensuring he had a clear, unobstructed view of Carmen. "Ma'am, I understand your concern," he said in a steady tone, "but I've already explained my position. I cannot change my seat." Carmen's frustration spilled over. "No, you don't understand," she cried, her voice rising further. "You're not just refusing to move, you're being downright callous. How can you be so indifferent to a child suffering?" Several passengers turned their heads to watch the confrontation, the previously subdued cabin now a stage for a public dispute. Miles, overwhelmed by the commotion, began to cry softly. Carmen's face contorted with both anger and sorrow as she tried to comfort him, but her words were drowned out by her own rising fury. "I'm asking you, no, demanding that you swap seats," she insisted, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's not just about convenience. It's about compassion." Ethan's expression remained impassive, though his mind raced with conflicting thoughts. As a federal agent, he was trained to handle hostility and high-pressure situations, but this was personal, a clash of everyday needs against rigid personal boundaries. "I'm sorry," he repeated, "but I cannot help you with that." The verbal sparring continued for several minutes, with Carmen's accusations growing more fervent. "You're heartless," she shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. "You're making this little boy suffer just to satisfy your own comfort." Each word seemed to echo off the walls of the narrow aisle, drawing more attention from the surrounding passengers. Ethan tried to reason with her, his tone even yet firm. "Ma'am, I assure you I'm not indifferent to anyone's suffering. I simply have made a decision about my seat prior to boarding. I cannot alter it now. I suggest you take a seat and try to calm your son. I'm not the one responsible for his condition." But Carmen's indignation only deepened. "You're deliberately choosing not to care," she insisted, her face flushed. "How can you look at a crying child and not do something to help? You're selfish and uncaring." The words hung in the air. Ethan felt a pang of regret that his polite refusal was interpreted as cold indifference. Yet he knew his decision was final. "I'm truly sorry if you feel that way," he replied quietly. "But I must remain where I am." Around them, whispers and murmurs grew. Some passengers expressed sympathy for Carmen's plight, while others admired Ethan's calm, collected demeanor under pressure. Miles's cries subsided for a moment as his mother attempted to regain composure, but the strain was evident. Carmen's voice, now a mix of defiance and desperation, rose one last time, "You're making a mockery of basic human decency." With that, she turned abruptly and stormed back to her seat, leaving Ethan to wonder if his refusal had sparked an irreversible chain of anger. In the wake of the confrontation, the cabin's atmosphere was fraught with uneasy silence. Ethan sat quietly, trying to focus on the in-flight magazine, yet the intensity of Carmen's outburst lingered in his thoughts. He understood that the situation was spiraling beyond a simple seat request. The emotional toll on Carmen, and on her son, was apparent, and he felt a pang of guilt that he had contributed to the disruption, even if only by remaining steadfast in his decision. As the flight continued, passengers resumed their subdued conversations. But for Ethan, the incident had left a mark. A reminder that even the smallest decisions can ignite a fire of emotions in the close quarters of an airplane. He resolved that when the plane landed, he would take a moment to check in on the situation. Though his decision had been final, he wondered if there might be another way to help without compromising his own comfort. The memory of Carmen's tearful eyes and the sound of her desperate pleas lingered in Ethan's mind long after the cabin lights had dimmed for the next phase of the flight. It was a clash of principle and compassion, a moment that would be etched into his recollections of that turbulent journey. As the heated exchange over the seat continued to simmer, Carmen's frustration took a darker turn. The conversation that had started with pleas for a simple seat swap began to warp under the weight of anger and prejudice. In a moment that would scar the memory of all who witnessed it, Carmen's rhetoric crossed a line no one should ever approach. It began subtly. After her repeated appeals and outbursts regarding her son Miles's discomfort, Carmen's tone shifted from desperate to vitriolic. With her face flushed in anger and tears threatening to spill, she suddenly spat out words that cut deeper than any polite refusal could. "You're nothing but a repulsive primate," she snarled, directing the insult at Ethan with a venom that shocked the surrounding passengers. The cabin fell silent. Ethan's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, leaving an indelible mark on everyone present. The insult wasn't just an offhand remark, it was an overt racial slur, laden with hatred and centuries of prejudice. Ethan felt a surge of both anger and sorrow. In all his years of service, he had encountered hostility, but rarely in such a raw, unfiltered manner from someone so seemingly ordinary. His training had prepared him for high-stakes confrontations and dangerous criminal behavior, but this was personal. It was a vile attack that sought to demean not just him, but all he represented. For a heartbeat, Ethan considered reacting impulsively. The urge to stand up, shout back, or even call for security burned inside him. But he quickly steeled himself, recalling the wisdom of maintaining professionalism under all circumstances. Instead, he forced his expression into one of quiet resolve, silently vowing not to let her hatred break his composure. Carmen, for her part, seemed momentarily taken aback by her own outburst. The harsh words had spilled out in anger, as if she had momentarily lost control of her tongue. Yet even as she faltered, her eyes gleamed with a dangerous mix of pride and bitterness. "I said what I meant," she insisted, her voice rising again, "and I'm not going to apologize for speaking the truth about you." Around them, whispers erupted among the passengers. Some exchanged disbelieving glances, while others fumbled with their phones, capturing the unfolding drama on video. The atmosphere in the cabin grew charged, the earlier tension now tainted with an unmistakable aura of hate. Ethan, summoning every ounce of professional restraint, responded in a measured tone, "Ma'am, such language is completely unacceptable and will not be tolerated. I am a passenger, and regardless of our differences, we must maintain decency." His voice, calm yet carrying a steely edge, was intended both as a rebuke and a warning. Carmen's face contorted, her fury intensifying at the sound of his calm reproach. "Don't tell me how to speak," she retorted, nearly shouting, "I have every right to express my opinion, especially when it concerns someone who's clearly hiding something behind that smug look of yours." In that charged moment, the gravity of her words settled in. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized that this was no longer just about a simple seat dispute or even parental concern, it was a calculated verbal assault steeped in racism. The very fact that Carmen chose such vile language, in a public setting and at the expense of his dignity, was a stark reminder of the deep-seated prejudices that still festered in society. As murmurs of disapproval grew louder from the other passengers, Ethan resolved that he would not allow this incident to go unanswered. He reached for his phone, discreetly beginning to record the exchange, not as an act of vengeance, but as a measure of self-protection and documentation. His calm, measured demeanor under such hateful provocation was, in itself, a quiet act of defiance. Though his pulse raced and his eyes burned with suppressed emotion, he maintained his professionalism, determined to see that the situation would be handled by the proper authorities. Carmen, still fuming, glared at him with a mixture of contempt and derision. "You think your silence makes you righteous," she sneered. "You're nothing but a coward hiding behind your badge and your fancy title." The words, though bitter, only hardened Ethan's resolve. At that point, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some visibly upset by the racist outburst. Ethan took a deep breath and, while keeping his gaze locked on Carmen, silently vowed that this incident would not go unchallenged. His recording continued, capturing every raw word, a testament to the fact that even in the most confined spaces, the battle against hatred must be fought with calm dignity. After the incendiary insult, Ethan Parker realized that the situation was spiraling dangerously. Determined to restore order and defuse the tension, he knew that transparency was essential. Without waiting another moment, he reached into his jacket and calmly pulled out his official badge, displaying it clearly for all to see. "Ma'am," Ethan said, his voice steady and authoritative, "I am a special agent with the Bureau of National Investigations. This is my official identification." He held the badge in view, letting the light catch its embossed details. The gesture was not one of aggression but of professional necessity, a reminder that he was not just any passenger, but someone entrusted with enforcing the law. Carmen's eyes darted to the badge, and for an instant, the fury in her gaze wavered. The room fell into an expectant silence as passengers strained to watch the unfolding drama. Some whispered to one another, while others recorded the moment on their smartphones. Even Miles, the young boy from earlier, seemed momentarily quiet, watching the exchange with wide eyes. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Ethan continued, maintaining eye contact. "I'm simply doing my job and enjoying my flight like everyone else. I ask that you please lower your voice and refrain from making any further derogatory comments." His tone was firm but calm, a balance of authority and respect. Carmen's face contorted with conflicting emotions. For a long moment, she appeared to waver between indignation and uncertainty. That doesn't change anything," she spat, though her voice lost some of its earlier venom. "I still think you're hiding something, and I won't be bullied by someone who hides behind a badge." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, though he kept his expression neutral. "I assure you, I am not hiding anything. I am here as a passenger, and I expect all of us to behave in a respectful manner. If you continue to use such language, I will have no choice but to escalate this matter to the appropriate authorities." The tension mounted once more as Carmen's gaze flickered nervously. She seemed to search for a way to regain control of the situation, but the clarity of Ethan's badge and the calm authority in his voice left little room for argument. A few passengers nodded in approval, their murmurs of support soft but resolute. Ethan carefully tucked his badge away after a few seconds, his expression softening slightly as he tried to bring the situation back to a level of normalcy. "I'd prefer that we all enjoy this flight in peace," he said, shifting his tone to one of measured calm. "Let's not allow personal differences or harsh words to disrupt our journey." Yet Carmen was not ready to relent. Her eyes still burned with a mix of anger and wounded pride. "You may have your fancy badge," she retorted, "but that doesn't mean you're above scrutiny. I have every right to be suspicious of someone who acts so secretive." Ethan shook his head, clearly disappointed by her continued hostility. "Suspicion is one thing, but resorting to racist insults and disruptive behavior is entirely unacceptable," he stated firmly. "I am here to work and to travel, not to be the target of such vitriol." At that moment, a couple of passengers near the front of the cabin began to murmur in agreement. Their looks of disapproval and sympathetic glances toward Ethan made it clear that his measured reaction was winning support. The atmosphere, though still charged, was slowly beginning to shift as the weight of his professionalism and the undeniable evidence of his identity bore down on Carmen's protestations. Ethan's measured demeanor was a stark contrast to Carmen's flaring temper. Even as she attempted to rally further accusations, Ethan remained implacable. "I urge you, for the sake of everyone on this flight, please calm down and refrain from further hostile behavior," he said one final time. "This is not the way to resolve differences." The cabin remained silent as his words settled over the passengers like a blanket. Carmen's defiance, though still present, had faltered in the face of undeniable proof of Ethan's credentials. In that defining moment, it became clear to everyone watching that authority was not a weapon to be wielded without respect, and that hate would find no refuge on this flight. With the tension slowly ebbing after Ethan Parker's display of his badge, the atmosphere in the cabin began to take on a fragile calm. Yet, the matter was far from resolved. Sensing that Carmen's aggressive behavior still simmered beneath the surface, Ethan shifted his focus to restoring order once and for all. Drawing a deep breath, he addressed the immediate situation in a clear, unyielding tone. "Ma'am, I must insist that you lower your voice and cease all further offensive remarks. Your behavior is not only disruptive, it is entirely inappropriate and, if necessary, subject to legal consequences." His words were measured and direct, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Carmen, still reeling from the earlier exchange and now confronted with Ethan's unwavering tone, bristled. "You think you can order me around just because you have a badge?" she snapped, her voice rising again despite the growing disapproval from nearby passengers. "I'm not some child you can simply control." Ethan maintained his calm posture, his gaze fixed steadily on hers. "I am not ordering you around, ma'am," he replied. "I am simply stating that on this flight, all passengers are expected to behave respectfully. Harassing language or personal attacks will not be tolerated. I warn you, if you continue, I will have to escalate this matter to the flight crew and, if needed, to law enforcement." His voice left no room for negotiation. The cabin fell into a hush as his words resonated among the passengers. A few individuals nodded in agreement, others looked on with expressions that ranged from concern to quiet admiration for Ethan's composure. The seriousness in his tone was unmistakable, a declaration that order and respect were paramount, regardless of personal differences. Carmen's eyes flickered with a mix of indignation and uncertainty. For a moment, she hesitated, as if caught between the impulse to continue her tirade and the stark reality of Ethan's calm authority. "You're not the only one who has rights on this plane," she retorted, though her voice wavered slightly. "I have every right to speak my mind, even if you don't agree with it." "Freedom of speech does not extend to hate speech," Ethan countered gently, "and certainly not to behavior that disrupts the safety and comfort of others. If you persist in making derogatory statements, I will be forced to involve the cabin crew." His tone was measured, but the firmness in his words left no doubt about his resolve. At that moment, an older passenger sitting a few rows ahead cleared her throat and said quietly, "I think we'd all appreciate a little calm. We're all here to get to our destination safely." Her words added weight to Ethan's admonition. Carmen's face reddened with anger. "You don't understand," she insisted, though her voice had lost some of its earlier venom. "I'm simply upset, my son is sick, and I'm doing what's best for him." Her eyes darted nervously toward Miles, the energetic boy whose earlier antics had already unsettled the cabin. Ethan softened momentarily, understanding the pressure of traveling with a young child, yet he did not waver. "I understand that traveling can be stressful, and I empathize with your situation," he said. "However, it is imperative that you express your concerns without resorting to insults or disruptive behavior. We all have the right to a peaceful flight." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted again, a collective breath taken as Carmen's defiance slowly began to crumble in the face of such clear, unwavering authority. Several passengers offered encouraging glances to Ethan, signaling their support for his call for decency. "Please, for the sake of everyone's comfort, and your own well-being, I ask that you calm down," Ethan repeated, his tone soft but insistent. "If you feel the need to escalate your concerns, I strongly advise you to do so through proper channels rather than through personal attacks. For a long moment, silence reigned as Carmen's eyes searched his face for any sign of leniency. Finally, she bit her lip and looked away, a spark of defiance still lingering, but clearly diminished by the force of Ethan's words. The tension began to ease, replaced by a cautious quiet that slowly settled over the cabin. Ethan knew that the situation might not be entirely resolved that moment, but he also felt that he had set a clear boundary. With a final nod toward the subdued Carmen, he returned his focus to the flight's progress. The cabin's collective mood, though still fragile, now leaned toward order and mutual respect, even as the memory of the confrontation would linger in the minds of all who had witnessed it. Before long, the commotion drew the attention of the flight crew. As tension simmered, an announcement crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reyes speaking. I have been informed of a situation involving inappropriate language and disruptive behavior." The cabin fell silent. All eyes turned toward the front, where the captain's calm yet authoritative voice echoed. "After reviewing reports and confirming with our crew, I must confirm that a passenger on this flight used a racial slur. This behavior is entirely unacceptable and violates our policy of respect and non-discrimination." Captain Reyes continued, "Due to the severity of the incident and for the safety and comfort of all passengers, I am ordering that the disruptive passenger be removed from this flight immediately." A murmur of approval rippled through the cabin. Ethan Parker, sitting quietly near the front, exchanged a brief glance with several fellow passengers. Even those who might have sympathized with Carmen's earlier pleas now recognized the gravity of her language and behavior. Within moments, a flight attendant approached Carmen, who had been sitting silently, her earlier defiance now replaced by uncertainty. "Ma'am, please come with me," the attendant said firmly but politely. As Carmen began to rise, murmurs of disapproval followed her like a shadow. Captain Reyes's announcement left little doubt, the captain had no tolerance for such behavior. His decisive intervention underscored the airline's commitment to maintaining an environment free from hate speech and disruption. The removal was swift. Flight attendants escorted Carmen to a separate area of the plane where she was to await further instructions. Soon after, security personnel, already on standby, joined the effort to physically escort her off the aircraft once the plane landed. For Ethan, the captain's intervention felt like a small but significant victory. The hateful words and disruptive behavior that had marred the flight were finally being addressed by the highest authority on board. As the plane continued its journey, the atmosphere gradually returned to a more subdued normalcy. Passengers, relieved by the resolution, resumed their conversations quietly. Ethan remained in his seat, his thoughts focused on the need for decency and respect, both in the air and on the ground. The captain's firm stance sent a clear message to all: there was no room for racial hatred or harassment on this flight, and those who violated that principle would face immediate consequences. After the captain's announcement and subsequent intervention, the situation reached its final act. Once the flight landed, Carmen, now widely known by her given name as a disruptive passenger, was physically escorted off the plane. Flight attendants and security personnel ensured that she left without incident. In the airport terminal, the mood remained somber yet resolute. Ethan Parker later filed a detailed report about the incident with the airline and the Bureau of National Investigations, documenting every step, from the initial confrontation to the captain's decisive intervention. His report included video footage, witness statements from several passengers, and a transcript of the captain's announcement. The airline took swift action. Within days, Carmen was permanently banned from flying with the carrier, and further, she was barred from entering the airport premises. The disruptive behavior that had unfolded on the flight resulted in additional legal charges being filed against her for harassment and disorderly conduct. News of the incident spread quickly throughout the travel community. Social media posts and news articles highlighted how the airline had zero tolerance for hate speech and disruptive behavior. Ethan's calm handling of the situation, as well as the captain's resolute intervention, became a symbol of accountability and the importance of standing up against discrimination even in the most confined spaces. In the days that followed, Passengers recalled the incident as a turning point, a moment when respect and decency were reasserted in the face of blatant hatred. Ethan continued his duties with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that his actions had contributed, even in a small way, to a safer travel environment. For Carmen, the consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Her career prospects and reputation took a significant hit, and the legal repercussions she faced served as a stark reminder that prejudice and disruptive behavior would not be tolerated. The final chapters of the incident, as detailed in Ethan's report, underscored the reality that justice, while sometimes delayed, ultimately prevailed. As the terminal slowly emptied and life resumed its normal pace, Ethan took a quiet moment to reflect on the events of that flight. Though the experience had been harrowing, it had also reinforced his commitment to upholding the principles of fairness and respect. In a world fraught with challenges, even in the most unexpected settings, he resolved to continue his work with the same unwavering integrity that had carried him through this ordeal. The incident, now a part of his long list of professional experiences, served as a powerful reminder: the fight against hate begins with standing firm in one's beliefs, even when confronted by hostility at 35,000 feet.